Well, oh, can you make me a host again to share my screen?
Okay. So welcome to our webinar hosted by the Vernon Area Public Library. The program is Behind the Beautiful Dress, Making Cloth and Clothing in the 19th Century. This program is brought to us by the Illinois Humanities Rhodes Scholar Speaker Bureau. The mission of the Illinois Humanities is to strengthen the social, political, and economic fabric of Illinois through constructive conversation and civic engagement. The Rhodes Scholar Speakers Bureau supports that mission by inviting Illinois authors, artists, and scholars to share their expertise and enthusiasm with people and communities throughout the state. After the event, we hope that you'll complete the audience feedback survey, which I will put in the chat, and you'll also will receive by email tomorrow. And this helps Illinois Humanities plan future programs and support their work. If you want to read more about the Rhodes Scholar programs, you can just visit ilhumanities.org. I'm really pleased to welcome our speaker tonight. Erika Holst is the curator of history at the Illinois State Museum. Her most recent exhibition currently on view is Fashioning Illinois, 1820 to 1900, a collection of 19th century clothing worn by Illinois women. Erika has worked in the public history field for more than 15 years, during which time she has curated more than a dozen exhibitions. So Erika, welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be here and share on this topic. And thank you for the lovely intro. As you mentioned, this talk is based on the current exhibition that's up at the Illinois State Museum, Fashioning Illinois. And if you want to come and see it, it is up at our Springfield location from now through July 12th, at which point it'll be moving to our Lockport Gallery, and it will be on view there August 3rd through January 17th. So I hope your interest is piqued enough to want to go see some of these garments in person. So when we first conceived of this show, it was meant as a way to get some of the clothing collection in front of the public. We actually have a really extensive and wonderful collection of 19th century clothing, primarily women's, although we do have some men's clothing, but far more women's garments. And so the exhibition was meant to just really put it on view and make it accessible to people. And so some of the things you'll see at the exhibit are a timeline of fashion. We go through from 1820 to 1900. 1820 was a logical starting point, A, because it's the closest decade to 1818 when Illinois became a state, and B, that's as early as our clothing goes. So we couldn't actually reach any farther back in time than that. So what you see is an 1820s and 1830s dress. 1840s and 1850s. Now we're into what we call the Romantic era, where we've got the big poofy hoop skirts and skirts bowed out by petticoats. 1860s, 70s, and 80s. The 70s and 80s are the bustle decades. And then finally rounding out with the 1890s and 1900s. And 1900s was just sort of an arbitrary place to cut it off because the exhibition was full as it was. So hopefully we'll be able to do a 20th century version of this show at some point and continue that story on to the 20th century. So I want to take a moment and just have you look at this beautiful dress, as the title suggests, and sort of if you want to drop in the chat some things that come to mind, or save that for later, or questions, or just think in your head. You don't have to share out loud if you don't want to, but you know, just what comes to mind when you look at a beautiful garment. Because I think the wonderful thing about historic clothing is that you can approach it from a lot of different angles. On the one hand, there's a lot of them are so aesthetically beautiful that if you just want to look at beautiful clothes and admire them that way, that's, you know, a very easy thing to do. They also are such vivid silhouettes of the women who wore them. Each of these garments was tailored to a specific woman's dimensions. And so it's literally, you know, you can see the shape of this woman who is a living, breathing woman, and puts us that much closer to imagining her life and her experiences. And then the way we're going to focus this talk is digging a little bit deeper into the making of these clothing. dresses. The cloth and clothing tell stories not just about the wearers of the clothing, but the makers as well, and the type of labor and economic systems that are underpinning the beautiful garments of the 19th century. And so we added kind of a corollary to the exhibit's themes after doing all our research and digging into the topic a little bit, that we also would like this exhibition to explore the human cost behind the growing accessibility of textiles and reflect on the social and economic systems underpinning the clothing industry today. Because a lot of the trends that you see in fast fashion, the kind of, I'm sorry to say, exploitation of the garment industry was baked in from the very beginning. And so this is something that we'll explore in this talk. But before we do that, we're going to go back to the very, very beginning and talk about cloth in early America. And we're going to start in colonial pre-revolutionary America and kind of trace the development of the textile and then the garment industries through the 19th century. So the first thing to know about cloth in early America is that it was all natural fibers, there's no synthetics, and it fell into 4 primary categories. There was cotton, flax, which are cellulose-based, which means they come from plant fibers. There's also wool and silk, which are protein-based, which means they come from animal fibers. And so everyone in early America was wearing some combination of these 4 fabrics. A lot of these fabrics were imported from Europe and Asia, all of them actually, cotton, linen, silk, and wool. And linen and wool were also spun and woven domestically. And so one important thing to understand about colonial era America is that they relied heavily on imported cloth. And a lot of times we have this sort of romantic view of the past that everyone was like self-sufficient and, you know, wove all their own clothing and grew all their own food and made all their own utensils. And that's not actually the case. America as a colony was sort of founded with the idea that it would be a market for consumer goods. Great Britain wanted to take North American resources, turn them into goods, and then sell them back to Americans. That was kind of part of the whole colonial relationship there. And so colonial America could not produce enough textiles to clothe its residents. So it was dependent on purchasing cloth from Europe. And the Industrial Revolution was well underway in Great Britain. So Great Britain had textile factories almost a century before Americans did. So Great Britain was cranking out factory-made woolens, factory-made linens. They were importing factory-made cottons from India, and then their own cotton industry got going. And so America's a ready market for this. And in a lot of urban areas, people could purchase textiles. Kind of the cost benefit analysis made it more economical to purchase than to make themselves. And European cloth came in all grades as well. So there were kind of coarse, cheaper grades being cranked out, as well as super, super fine grades. So most Americans in colonial times used or had access to linen produced in Scotland, Ireland, England, and northern continental Europe. Wool produced in England, cotton produced in India or later grown in India and woven in England, and silk produced in China or England or France or the Revolution. So even from the very beginning, American colonists are part of this like global commercial economic network. Homespun cloth definitely was an option though, and there tended to be a sort of rural-urban split. If you lived in urban areas, you were much more likely to purchase imported cloth. If you lived in rural areas, you were much more likely to homespun your own cloth, although probably you might supplement it with some purchased cloth as well. So homespun cloth is very labor intensive, and we're looking at the flax making process here. So turning flax into linen is inexpensive in terms of cash outlay. It's very expensive in terms of the labor that you're investing. To make linen cloth, you need to start about a year out from the time that you want a piece of clothing in your hands by sewing. sowing your seeds, letting it grow. Then you need to pull the flax, ripple it, which means pull the little seed things through basically a giant comb, retting it, which means letting it soak in water to kind of break down the woody stalk, breaking it, so breaking those fibers apart, sketching it and hackling it are ways of beating the stalk and pulling it through teeth again to make it kind of fine and able to be woven. And then finally spinning and weaving. So if you are cash poor, but you have the time on your hands, homespun cloth is a great way to clothe your family. But again, the investment of labor is so intensive that you'll see when this factory made cloth, as it grows more and more readily available to American consumers, people choose it just because they'd rather spend the money than the time, which I think is something we can relate to today. Those of us who have sewing skills, of which I am not one, but I've heard people in the Q&A portion of this talk, one woman was a knitter and said, you know, it's cheaper for me to buy a sock than it is to buy the yarn and spend the time to make socks. So we all kind of make these cost-benefit analyses in our lives. So this is a homespun dress that's on display in the exhibit. This is made of a linsey woolsey fabric, which is wool woven together with linen. And I wish you were here to see it in person because it's a very coarse fabric. It's not super fine. It probably would have been scratchy on the skin. So this is a serviceable garment. It was woven by a woman who lived on a farm in Maconda, Illinois, way in the southern part of the state. But it's not like a super fine fabric. So if high quality or fine weaving was what people were after, they generally had to purchase it. Okay, so after the revolution, a lot of things start to change in American industry. Basically, the United States is free of the laws and taxes and regulations imposed by England that limit American trade and suppress American industry, of which there were many, because remember, America was a consumer of British goods, and so Britain had no interest in America being a producer of its own goods that would cut Britain out of that market. With British rule over, American trade and industry start to flourish. So people start smuggling designs for textile machinery out of England. England still isn't super eager to hand them over or share them willingly, but there's basically like industrial espionage going on where people go to England, take note of the textile machinery they see and bring it home and try to replicate it. So by 1790, the first American spinning factory is established in Rhode Island. In 1814, Francis Cabot Lowell establishes the first American textile factory in Massachusetts. We know it as the Lowell Mills. And by 1860, there are more than 878 textile factories in New England. And so what does that look like for the lives of the people working there? Well, Lowell pioneered this new system of working in his mills where he recruited unmarried daughters of Yankee farmers to work in his mills. And there are benefits to this relationship. A lot of the women working on these farms, they tended to be the young daughters and unmarried family members who would work in their youth, and many of them later went on to marry and left work when they were done being married. But these unmarried women, first of all, they had a lot of labor on the farms that they were working on. So in some ways, factory work was preferable to farm work. This provided economic opportunity to women for whom there just wasn't a whole lot in rural New England. So these women had a chance to leave home, make their own money, buy their own clothes, gain some independence. The downsides were that, first of all, there's no labor laws like we understand them today. Most of these women are working 12 to 14 hours a day, 5.5 days a week, half a day off on Saturday and all day off on Sunday. Their lives are pretty strictly controlled by the corporation. The women were boarded in dormitories, and the corporations had this vested interest in projecting this idea of these like moral and kind of well-regulated mills, because the mills in Britain were kind of like infamous. You know, they were supposed to be run by women of, you know, loose character and anything goes, and they heard all these horror stories, whether they were true or not. So the American mills are trying to very cultivate this image, which meant that women, you know, were subject to the corporate overseer dictating, you know, what their curfew is and who they see and what they do. And these working conditions are not great. There's a lot of lint and textile, like dust and pieces of fabric floating around in the air that's getting inhaled. The machines are very noisy. The machines are dangerous. You know, it's not uncommon for a piece of clothing or even a, you know, finger to get caught in things and terrible injuries to happen. So by 1834, the mill girls are starting to strike to protest the low wages, long hours, and harsh working conditions. So thinking back to that beautiful dress that we saw at the beginning, the cream colored one, part of its story, it's a cotton dress, may well be the life of the female textile worker that's kind of woven into the fabric, whose labor helped to create the textile for that dress. Another revolutionary happening in the development of the American textile industry is the invention of the cotton gin in 1793. So Eli Whitney visited a plantation in the South and reportedly saw a machine that enslaved engineers had kind of developed, and took that idea, went home and patented it. And this represented a breakthrough in the cotton industry and dramatically changed the nature of the American economy for the next half century plus. Cotton was not a profitable crop before the invention of the cotton gin, because cleaning the seeds out of it was very labor intensive. It could be grown, it could be harvested, but picking all the seeds out of it took a long time. And so cotton couldn't be produced fast enough to make it a profitable crop. All of a sudden, with the cotton gin, you could clean as much cotton in a day as you might have been able to clean in a year. And so now it's an extremely profitable crop. And this happens at a time when there's kind of a shift in American economy going on in terms of land use. So the old slaveholding regions of the United States are Virginia, Maryland, to some degree North Carolina, and those tended to be tobacco growing areas of the country and early colonial sites. And by the turn of the 19th century, the tobacco growing fields had been kind of depleted, and the lands lost much of their fertility. And so farmers were moving to a mixed farming with an emphasis on wheat and livestock. There was less need for enslaved labor. The enslaved laborers who were working in these states were used to working on what's called the task system. And enslaved people were given certain tasks to produce every day, and the incentive being when they finished them, the rest of the time in that day was their own. All of a sudden, and so the fate of slavery in the United States kind of teetered in the balance in the early 19th century because it wasn't profitable in the traditional old slavery states. Unfortunately, now you have cotton, which does become profitable, and the cotton growing regions are in the deep South here. So Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, parts of Arkansas, Louisiana, Texas. And so you have this land rush in the early 19th century of settlers flocking to the Southeast to settle on this rich farmland so they can start growing cotton and get in on this cotton boom, this cotton economy. It's not like these lands were just open and ready and waiting for people. They were inhabited by indigenous people who were removed to make way for these settlers coming in to farm and grow cotton. So the Indian Removal Act of 1830 is directly related to people's desire for these lands to grow cotton on. And so indigenous peoples were moved off their land and west of the Mississippi River, and people from all over the United States flocked down to this area to try to have their shot. It was like a dot-com economy. You know, people wanted to get in on the action and get in on the boom. So this cotton economy controlled the destiny of millions of enslaved people because the increased demand for cotton resulted in an increased demand for enslaved people. And so slaves were transported in a massive forced migration overland and by sea from older states such as Virginia, Maryland, down to the cotton growing states of Alabama, Georgia, Mississippi, Arkansas. And once there, they encountered a system of enslavement which was more brutal than anything they had encountered in the Upper South. It was a system in which, well, I'll let Solomon Northup from 12 Years a Slave, I'll read you a quote from his narrative, and it explains it very well. He said, "When a new hand, one unaccustomed to the business, is sent for the first time into the field, he is whipped up smartly and made for that day to pick as fast as he can possibly. At night it is weighed so that his capability in cotton picking is known. He must bring in the same weight each night following. If it falls short, it is considered that he has been laggard, and a greater or less number of lashes is the penalty." So it's sort of a very controlled system of essentially torture that's stimulating production of cotton in the South. And we tend to think of the cotton economy and enslavement as sort of a Southern phenomenon, but the truth of the matter is that the entire United States was wrapped into it. Of course, there were planters in the South who were actually enslaving people, but there was plenty of Northern and Western money being poured into the cotton economy as well. There were New England textile mills that were processing the cotton. Northern bankers were financing the purchase and holding the mortgages on these southern plantations. The merchants were shipping it to England for processing. And also the everyday American consumer was benefiting from the availability of inexpensive, brightly colored, washable, durable cotton fabric in their lives. And so basically, when we look at this beautiful dress, which is a roller printed cotton dress from the 1830s, one of the stories behind it is that enslavement of millions of African Americans to kind of prop up this economy and make this cotton available to American consumers. And so cotton changed Americans' relationships to textiles. It kind of cemented the shift from home-produced, homespun clothing to factory-made textiles. So American households became consumers, not producers of cloth. And you can also see the relationship between the increased availability of textiles and women's fashion. So this is a fashion plate from the 1830s. She's got the big belled skirt. She's got the very poofy sleeves. This is undoubtedly a printed cotton calico dress that she's wearing. And this type of fashion just isn't possible unless there is cheap cloth available. You know, for this look to work, it probably required somewhere between 6 and 8 yards of fabric. And so, and the availability of cloth meant that people could be extravagant in the yardage of fabric used in their fashions. So the cotton industry developed the ready-made clothing industry. There's a straight line from one to the other. And the straight line is that with increased cotton production at home, both cotton being grown and cotton being processed in the New England textile mills, there became sort of like this bottleneck because there's so much yardage being produced, and how many yards of fabric does a person need? You know, at one point, all this yardage of fabric being produced needs to turn into a consumer product to find a market. And so that consumer product happened to be ready-made clothing. And it starts with men's clothing, and I will get into that in a bit, but first I'm going to backtrack just a little bit to talk about the process of making clothing, specifically women's clothing in the 19th century. So throughout the 18th century for men and for most of the 19th century for women, all clothing was made for somebody, not for anybody. It's a complete antithetical to how it is today. Today we can go into a store and if you're, a size 10 pant or a size medium top or a, 36 waist, you go pick it off the rack and you're pretty assured that it'll fit you more or less, exactly. In the 18th and 19th centuries, especially for women's clothing, this clothing is custom made to a person's body. So they're very specific measurements. And I noticed this when I was dressing these garments for the fashion exhibit. It was such a challenge because, we had these standard size mannequins and so much had to be done to get the garments to fit. There were a lot of them that I had to take an electric knife and cut down to size because the waist wasn't small enough, even if it was a child's mannequin. I had to stuff the bodice with stockinette to reproduce, the bust and the hips and the idiosyncrasies of each woman's torso basically had to be recreated on each mannequin to fit that garment. So women had two choices in the 19th century. They could make garments by hand or they could hire a dressmaker to make garments for them. And it usually wasn't that black and white. Most women did a combination of both of them, especially if they lived in any kind of urban area. If you lived in a rural area, probably you might be making all your garments by hand. But women who lived in more urban areas probably made some of their garments and hired dressmakers to make other garments for them. So basically, all 19th century women knew how to sew. And there's this wonderful quote from a domestic advice manual that says, "A woman who doesn't know how to sew is as deficient in her education as a man who cannot write." It was considered a basic life skill that all girls should learn. A needle would be put in the hands of a small girl from the time she was about 4 or 5 years old, and it would be a constant labor for the rest of her life, both sewing clothing for her family and also mending and creating household textiles. So most women typically made their own undergarments. So you're looking at a chemise in the upper left-hand corner. They often made their children's clothes as well. And then often as well their husband's shirts, although these did start to be mass-produced by about the middle of the 19th century. So kind of you can see there's these aren't precisely fitted garments. They're kind of like rectangular. The less precise the fit, the more likely it was that it was made by the lady of the house. Dressmakers come in for garments that require a precise fit. And dressmakers were independent craftswomen in the 19th century. They designed, measured, cut, basted, sewed, pressed garments for their clients. They were expected to be up on all the latest styles. They were expected to create a smooth silhouette that fit very nicely. And so dressmakers was at the top of women's available professions in terms of both status and the earning potential, essentially. So women who were good with a needle might carve out an independent financial path for themselves, who might otherwise have worked domestic service or factory jobs or been teachers or things that were less well-paying. And so as independent craftswomen, a lot of dressmakers visited their clients in their own homes. They might stay for a few days. They would kind of move from client to client, take up residence for a few days, do the family sewing, and then move on to a different client. The most successful dressmakers had shops of their own, and many even employed like journeywomen, seamstresses, who would help them with kind of the plainer aspects of sewing. So we talked about the development of the ready-made clothing industry, so we'll circle back to that. In about the 1820s, in the Jacksonian era, there was sort of this removal of the stigma of ready-made clothing. Prior to that, there were ready-made sailors' shirts that navies would buy kind of in bulk for federal navies. And so ready-made clothing kind of had this sort of social stigma about it. But when Jacksonian democracy and the era of the common man and the self-made man rolled in, there was this idea that, you know, all you need really to get ahead in life is to kind of be a hardworking person who follows the rules of etiquette. And so it didn't matter so much, you know, how precise the fit of your shirt was and if it was made by a tailor or not. So the social stigma dropped. And you also see men's clothes start to be mass produced just because they're not as precise a fit as women's clothing, especially with shirts. As we saw back here, this is very like down here, it's a very rectangular shape. So it's sort of easy to put together in a kind of mass capacity. So we need to point out that the sewing machine was not invented until the 1840s. It didn't really find its way into tailor shops until the 1850s, yet clothing is being mass produced from the 1820s on. So how did this happen? How are these tailors making it happen without kind of the technology that you might think underpins it? The first trick they're using is standardized tailoring methods of measuring and drafting. So there are systems developed where instead of needing to see each client and take like 50 different measurements all over his body, they're sort of like these standard measurements. And if you know this measurement, you can calculate this. So the measuring system gets standardized a lot and streamlined a lot. There's also, it separates the drafter from the cutter of the cloth. And the other reason that mass production is possible is that merchant tailors started replacing skilled male tailors and female dressmakers and clothing makers with unskilled labor, which was usually that of women and children. So in 1832, for example, the tailor shops of Boston employed 300 men, 100 boys, and 1,300 women. The men were paid $2 a day, the women and boys were paid 50 cents a day. And so these seamstresses who are working in the garment industry are doing what's known as plain sewing. So they're stitching hems, they're doing straight sewing, buttons, and all of this is considered unskilled labor. Remember how we talked about sewing was such an almost universal trait that it was assumed all women knew how to sew, and so they weren't compensated as skilled craftspeople. They were compensated as unskilled labor. So to make a shirt in the 1820s, a woman would sew up to 20,000 stitches. It would take her 12 to 14 hours a day. She might work 6 days a week, get paid 12.5 cents per shirt. She might be able to make 6 to 9 shirts per week, which meant she earned 75 cents to $1.12 per week. And a lot of seamstresses worked on what was called the putting out system, which meant that they would go to the merchant tailor and pick up a pre-cut bundle of fabric and then take it home and assemble it and then press it and return it to the tailor. And so this is an attractive means of employment for women, especially if they have dependents at home. If you are a widow or an abandoned wife with small kids who depend on you, then a factory job isn't an option. You need to have work that you can do from home. And so a lot of these women would pick up these bundles of cloth. They are competing with lots of other women in the labor market who need work as well. They're competing with charitable sewing societies who would sew clothes for the poor for charity, and they were competing with prison labor. So there's a big labor pool, and this helped to drive down the wages and the compensation for women. So again, behind the beautiful dresses that you see on the right side of the screen for all these elegant ladies at the party is a woman who might be, you know, sewing in her drafty attic flat, trying to make ends meet and put food on the table for her kids. So the sewing machine is Isaac Singer patented his machine in 1851. These first machines are heavy and expensive, and so they didn't really reach into middle-class homes until the late 1860s and 1870s. In the 1850s and most of the 1860s, they're in garment manufacturers and tailor shops. And so this brings about another kind of evolution in the way that the garment industry functioned. Now you have the inside system. And so because these machines are big and clunky and expensive and not a lot of people have them, garment manufacturers would invest in a lot of sewing machines and then bring women into a central shop to manufacture things. So here you're looking at a hoop skirt factory and women sitting at their sewing machines sewing hoop skirts. And so this becomes an attractive option for unmarried women or women without dependents who can do work outside the home. It leaves out the women who are tied to the home because of their children. Sewing machine operators got higher wages than hand sewers. It was a smaller labor pool of people who were familiar with machines, and so they were considered skilled workers, whereas hand sewers were considered unskilled workers. Still, women operators were paid 1/3 to 1/4 of the labor of men. They had to buy their thread, rent the machine, and take home what couldn't be finished in a day. So contractors utilized the putting out system with sewing machines as well. Some contractors required seamstresses to use sewing machines at home to create a more standardized product, which meant renting a machine. And so a lot of hand sewers were put out of work if they couldn't afford to buy a machine. And so the sewing machine was billed as this great labor-saving device, and certainly it did save a lot of labor for a lot of sewers, but kind of the dark side of that is that it was hard on women who didn't have access to one, but who depended on sewing for their livelihood. And of course, with the rise of the sewing machine comes the rise of the sweatshop. And a sweatshop is sort of a kind of like mid-level contractor. A sweatshop might be someone who purchases a contract to make clothing, and he will assemble a handful of machines and workers to man them. And so, oftentimes there's immigrant labor tied to sweatshops because, again, the labor pool is large, and so wages are driven down, and there's not really a lot of regulation on the conditions. People can be crammed into sort of unhealthy locations in tenement flats. And a lot of this, so from the very first putting out system to the sewing machine inside system and the sweatshop system, the exploitation of labor is sort of what makes ready-made clothing affordable and what makes the business model work, unfortunately. And in American history, there's never really been a time when that exploitation of inexpensive labor isn't part of the business model of the garment industry. So what's behind this beautiful blouse, which was made at a shirtwaist factory, probably not unlike the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory that many of us are familiar with, is a woman who is probably a working class woman working at a factory job for low labor, probably in an unhealthy situation. And so at the end of the day, when we look at a beautiful dress like this, what's behind it? It's complicated. There are a lot of stories there. There's the story of the woman who wore it. There's the story of the woman who made it. There might be exploitation of labor sewn into this garment. There might be enslavement that's a part of this garment story, especially if it contains any cotton. There might be economic opportunity if it was made by a dressmaker from her own business, or if it contains part of, cotton woven by a Lowell girl who's out on her own making her own money. It might represent independence, both for the wearer who chooses her own fashions and by the maker and her economic independence. It might represent access to fashion that got more and more democratic as the century wore on. And it might represent the drudgery of a woman who needs to make her own clothes, and it's a household chore that she doesn't enjoy, but it really has to get done. So with that, I want to stop and invite you to think a little bit about what's behind your clothing. Do you have a sense of who makes it and what conditions do they labor under? If we don't know that information, which I don't, I have no idea who made the shirt that I'm wearing, but it just kind of illustrates how far we've come from the beginning of the 19th century when all clothing was made specifically for an individual. How invested are you in your clothing? Again, I don't sew, so my clothing I'm not deeply invested in it. If it has a good memory, I might have sentimental associations with it, but if I, feel like it doesn't fit well or don't like the style, I usually donate my clothing to Goodwill. I have noticed since I've started working in this fashion exhibit, I taught myself how to darn socks, and I darn my son's little socks that often get holes in them. And I'm much more attached to those socks than really anything I own, because I've put my, labor into his socks. And so I will hang on to those socks much longer than anything else. And so, the investment in our clothing, I think, is proportional to how much time and energy we've invested into it. So I want to open it up to any questions that you might have for me, or if you want to continue this discussion and share your thoughts about, the clothes that you're wearing, where it might come from, what your clothing means to you. Let's talk about it.
Erika, thank you so much. Erika, am I on video now or no? I'm getting kind of a weird message.
Yes, I can see you.
It's really weird. Okay, good. Okay, I was kind of getting a weird message here. But anyhow, thank you so much for that really thoughtful presentation. I don't know that, and most people kind of really think about the labor and the people behind the clothing that they wear. And it just really kind of brings up a lot of issues. And I know that like right now, there's a lot of kind of discussion going on when it comes to like the environment and climate change and things of that nature, about how the clothing industry contributes to that problem, which we don't really think about. But from what I understand, some of the biggest problems have to do with greenhouse gas emissions that factories produce, and just how clothing or textiles are, what happens to them when we're done with them. And it seems that like the clothing industry really today still is a really complex, is much more complex than what you would think, I guess.
It absolutely is. And now we've got the introduction of synthetic fibers. So yeah, the production involves, like a high carbon footprint of these synthetic, fibers, and then they don't break down. A lot of clothing winds up in landfills and, doesn't biodegrade because it's synthetic, they're synthetic projects. So yeah, there's lots of different issues. And
I know there's some companies that are kind of trying to manufacture clothing, and they kind of label themselves as, sustainable companies that, have a smaller carbon footprint, or, repurpose some materials. So I know some companies are starting to kind of brand themselves that way.
They are, and I think that brings up another interesting point, because often if there's, a company that's committed to fair labor or sustainability, those clothes tend to be more expensive, Right. So I think a lot of us would love to dress ethically, but like, who can afford to be ethical, it's not as accessible. And so those choices have to be made about, what do I need, what can I afford, and that's,
well, I think it challenges a lot of things, being sustainable, like being friendly to the environment, definitely sometimes has a higher cost associated with it. So it's kind of, as individuals and companies, how are we going to like decide, we have to make decisions about what we're going to invest in, I guess. One of my questions I had for you about some of the clothing that you shared and that be on display is, how did you come about this collection of clothing?
That's a great question. So the museum is nearly 150 years old, so it has been acquiring clothing for a long time. In fact, some of our dresses were donated to us by Governor of Illinois' wives in the beginning of the 20th century. So they fall into kind of two categories. We get individual donations, and those are frankly more interesting to me because they tend to come with a solid history. You know, one person will donate a garment or a small collection of items, and they'll say, you know, this belonged to my great grandmother. She wore it in Waverly, Illinois. You know, there's a detailed history that comes to it. So that's maybe I would say a third of our clothing collection. The remaining 2/3 include garments that we absorbed from both the U of I and Illinois State University. Both had large garment collections in their home economic departments. And when they folded and, you know, decided they didn't want the clothing anymore, they came to the State Museum. So a lot of those are beautiful examples. They tend not to come with the personal histories because they were acquired as representations of the craft rather than like as objects with stories.
And it seems you had more women's clothing than men's clothing. Is that just because there's more variety amongst women's clothing, more interesting to look at, or is that just kind of what I saw?
Definitely. So our exhibit is all women's clothing because I had to cut it off somewhere, and you know there was so much to show that I just couldn't fit men in. So sorry, men, maybe next time. But in terms of our collection, we definitely have more women's clothing, and I think I don't know if there's like kind of a bias that women tend to be the people who donate to museums more. You kind of the keeper of the family legacy seems to like, I get approached for donations more by women than men in general. There's an element of like women's clothing, I think is generally more aesthetically appealing, you know, like a man is like, oh, the frock coat is like 3 inches shorter this year, you know, or a woman's like, oh, we went from the hoop skirt to the bustle, you know, it's more dynamic and it's, you know, brighter colors. And so people kind of want to save it more, I think.
Do you have a favorite piece? Is there a favorite piece of yours in the collection that you just kind of thought said a lot, like had a strong message or a really powerful story?
There was, so, and I don't think I showed it in this presentation, but there is a wedding dress that came to us, and it's from a woman who got married in 1854, and then sadly she died in childbirth a year later. And so when I was researching that wedding dress, I happened to reach out on Ancestry and make contact with a descendant, and she said, oh yeah, I can tell you all about this woman. I know the family story. And she said, also, I've got a trunk of her clothing and I'd be happy to donate it to the museum. And so her clothing had been, she was born in New York, and her husband and she moved to Rockford, Illinois. So after her death, she was taken back to New York to be buried. All her things were packed up and kind of put in the family home in New York and sat there for 150 years. And so we received a maternity nightgown. And so that went into the exhibit as well. And it was just this kind of wonderful, but also heartbreaking, you know, just the life cycle of the young woman. And then she's this like heavily pregnant, you know, she's got a nightgown, and then like that's the end of her life. And you know.
Wow. That is interesting. How interesting that you found somebody on Ancestry like that. We do have a question from somebody put in the Q&A. Someone would like to know about children's clothing. Are they essentially miniature versions of adult clothing or something different at this time? But I guess looking at the time period that you were researching for this project.
That's a great question. Thanks. Okay, so some distinct differences from modern children's clothing. From birth to about 3 years old, all kids were dressed the same. They really weren't big on distinguishing gender. It was more important that tiny children look different from like adults and bigger children. And so that, and I'll see if I can click back here. There we go. So on the bottom, this is a baby dress. Infants were dressed in long dresses before they were mobile. So if you're not yet crawling, you would just be in a long dress, and they would fold the bottom over the little feet to keep them warm. And so a lot of people think like it's a christening dress when you see that, but generally like all infants are in these, they're called long clothes. By the time a small child is like mobile, is crawling or walking around, then it goes into a short dress, again, whether it's a boy or a girl. And these clothing tended to be white, which seems like the least logical choice to
Right.
put fancy children in. At that time, it was the most practical because the white unbleached fabrics were the one that you could toss in like the boiling wash water and like scrub the heck out of it, and they weren't going to fade or anything. And linen, which was a common fabric, actually gets softer when you wash it, so it becomes like this wonderful like silky feel. So by the time from 3 to 7, gender differences start to emerge. So a little boy might go into short pants, a little girl might go into a short dress. And so from then on, they look pretty much like miniature adults with the exception of the length of the either shorts or the skirts. And so when a girl is in like long skirts around like say 14 or 15 and a boy goes into long pants, that's like a kind of a milestone, a signal of maturity. Same with when the boy goes from wearing a dress into pants, it's called breeching, and that's like a milestone in a little boy's life.
Interesting. I wonder when we started putting like animals and butterflies and flowers on our children's clothing, when we decided that we wanted them to look distinctly different from, our own clothes. It's interesting. Anyway, here's a question here in the Q&A. Someone would like to know, someone said, upon visiting the Victoria and Albert Museum in London, I learned that the collection did not include much everyday wear as it was used more and worn out. Dressier items were more likely to be handed down. Is this also true of the Illinois collection?
Totally, and that's exactly right. And that's why my favorite pieces in the collection, again, which aren't in the slideshow, but we have a couple work dresses, and they survive so rarely because, it was just something that people wore until they wore out. And a common practice was to make over garments. So let's say like you have a dress and you've worn it, and now the like sleeves are bare, and maybe you've gotten a couple like stains or holes on the skirt, then you like take it apart, cut it apart, and you might refashion it into something new, or you might refashion it into kids' clothes. So people really like sucked every bit of life out of fabric that they could. So it really was the high-end clothing, the special clothing, and also the clothing from more affluent people who could afford to like preserve this garment and put it away. It's not like typically representative of like what everybody was wearing. So we tend to see this like skewed, in a museum perspective, that like everyone's in a silk dress, right? Like this gorgeous silk dress, when in reality, people are probably in like the serviceable cotton dress that got like turned into their younger sister's dress, that got turned into their baby's dress, that got turned into a wash rag and disappeared.
Let's see, someone here writes a comment. In respect to what people did with the old clothes, my grandmother made crocheted rugs and quilts. Being a quilter myself, I use new fabrics, but I know she used the parts of old clothing.
Yeah, that's awesome. Yes, and that's part of that life cycle of clothing. So you would wear it and then cut it down and create a garment for someone smaller than you, and that person would wear it out. And then the next stop is recycling. You might take scraps of fabric, if it's cotton or linen, to the rag man, who will use it in the paper industry and who will, pay you a couple pennies for it. Or you might like that person said, weave it into a rag rug or turn it into a quilt. So yeah, people were very conscious of, the monetary value of fabric, and also like the labor invested in fabric, and really like used it as much as they could.
Well, good. I think we had some really good comments, really thoughtful feedback. So I think those are all the questions that we have right now for tonight. And Erika, I just wanted to thank you for just a really interesting, thoughtful presentation. I'm so glad that we got a chance to host you here at our library. And the exhibit sounds fantastic. I wish you lots of success with that. And everyone, just thank you for joining us tonight. Everyone at home that joined us, we hope that you really enjoyed it. I did put the link to the survey in the chat. You'll also get it from me tomorrow, because I will send a recording of the presentation. It'll be on our YouTube channel, and then you're welcome to share it with your friends or family who maybe didn't join us tonight, but you think would have an interest in this topic. So I think that's it. So I'm just going to wish everybody a good night.
Thanks so much. Thanks for having me.
You're welcome. Bye-bye.
Bye.